The eye of the needle of global power, the passage. Between the coasts of Iran and Oman, the sea narrows into a confined corridor, a passage of water, barely wide enough to contain the movement it must carry. There are no cities here that define it, no monuments that announce its importance. And yet, every day, enormous vessels pass through this narrow space. Slowly, heavily, without interruption, they carry oil, energy, the invisible foundation of modern life. Nearly a fifth of the world's traded petroleum moves through this single maritime corridor. Not because it was chosen, but because there is no alternative. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a location on a map. It is a point of convergence. Geography, economy, and power meet here in their most concentrated form. And like so many narrow passages throughout history, its significance does not lie in what it is, but in what passes through it. Chapter 1. The Geography of Power. The Strait of Hormuz lies between the Persian Gulf and the open waters of the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it stretches only around 40 kilometers from shore to shore. But this number alone does not explain its importance. What matters is not its width, but its function. To the north lies Iran. To the south, the Musandam Peninsula of Oman. Between them, the sea compresses into a confined maritime corridor, a natural bottleneck. All maritime traffic entering or leaving the Persian Gulf must pass through this space. There is no parallel route, no alternative channel. Geography allows no deviation. Large oil tankers, among the biggest moving structures ever built by human hands, are forced into carefully defined shipping lanes. These lanes are narrow. In each direction, only a few kilometers separate safe passage from potential danger. The margin for error is small. The consequences of disruption are immense, because beyond this narrow corridor lies a region of extraordinary concentration. The Persian Gulf contains some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates depend on maritime export routes to sustain their economic systems. And all of these routes converge at a single exit point, the Strait of Hormuz. This creates a structural dependency, not only for the states that produce energy, but for those that consume it. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, entire economies rely on the uninterrupted flow of oil and gas. And a significant portion of that flow must pass through this narrow maritime passage. This is where geography becomes power, not through intention, but through inevitability. Unlike borders drawn by human hands, this constraint cannot be negotiated. It cannot be redrawn. It exists as a fixed condition, a permanent feature of the natural world. Throughout history, such locations have always carried strategic weight. Mountain passes, river crossings, straits. Where movement is forced into narrow paths, control becomes possible. And where control becomes possible, power begins to concentrate. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the clearest modern examples of this principle. Its importance is not created by political decisions alone. It is embedded in the structure of the landscape itself. Even in periods of relative stability, this underlying tension remains, because the system depends on continuity, on uninterrupted flow. And any disruption, whether through conflict, blockade, or accident, would not remain local. It would extend outward, through supply chains, through markets, through entire national economies. This is what transforms a narrow stretch of water into a global concern, not its size, but its role within a much larger system. A system that has developed over decades, yet rests upon a geographic constraint that has existed for millennia. The ships that pass through the strait today are modern. Their cargo is industrial, their purpose economic. But the underlying dynamic is far older. A narrow passage, a forced route, and the enduring question of who controls it. Chapter 2. Before oil, trade, empires, and early connections. The ships that pass through the Strait of Hormuz today are part of a modern system. Their cargo is measured in millions of barrels. Their routes calculated with precision. Their movement monitored in real time. But long before oil defined the importance of this region, the waters between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea were already part of a wider network. Not yet global, not yet industrial, but significant. Because even in antiquity, movement between regions depended on geography, and the Persian Gulf formed a natural corridor between worlds. To the west lay Mesopotamia, a region shaped by rivers, cities, and early state structures. To the east, the Indian subcontinent, rich in resources, textiles, spices, and cultural complexity. Between them stretched a maritime space that allowed connection. Not constant, not always predictable, but possible. Archaeological evidence suggests that, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, trade networks linked Mesopotamia with regions along the Arabian coast and the Indus Valley. Goods moved slowly. Copper, timber, precious stones. They followed both land routes and coastal sea paths. The waters of the Persian Gulf were not yet dominated by large vessels, but by smaller ships navigating close to shore. The open sea remained uncertain, but the coastline offered orientation. And within this system, the narrow exit toward the Arabian Sea, what is now known as the Strait of Hormuz, formed a natural threshold. A point of transition, not necessarily controlled in a strict political sense, but structurally important, because it marked the passage between a relatively enclosed maritime space and the wider ocean beyond. Empires that emerged in this region understood the value of connectivity. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which rose in the 6th century BCE, extended its influence across vast territories, from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Its power was not based solely on military strength, but on its ability to integrate regions. Roads were built, administrative systems established, and maritime routes, though less documented than land networks, played a supporting role in this structure. The Persian Gulf became part of an imperial environment, a space where goods, people, and ideas could move. Not freely, but within a framework shaped by authority. It would be misleading to imagine the Strait of Hormuz at this time as a heavily fortified or continuously contested passage. The historical record does not support such a picture. Control, in the modern sense, was limited. Naval capabilities were restricted. And the scale of trade, while significant, did not yet approach the intensity of later periods. And yet the underlying dynamic was already present. A narrow passage connecting two larger systems. A geographic constraint that shaped movement. And with it, the early recognition, perhaps not fully articulated, but gradually understood, that certain places derive their importance, not from what exists within them, but from what must pass through them. Over centuries, different powers would emerge and decline in this region. Local rulers, regional kingdoms, expanding empires, each interacting with the same landscape, each adapting to the same conditions. The strait itself remained unchanged, its waters indifferent to the shifting patterns of human authority. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, its role became more defined. Not yet a focal point of global strategy, but already a structural element within broader systems of exchange. The intensity would come later, with new technologies, with expanding networks, with the ambitions of distant powers. But the foundation was already there. A corridor, a connection, a passage that could not be ignored. Chapter 3. Empires of the Sea. For centuries, the waters between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea had remained a space of movement. Trade passed through. Empires rose along its shores. But the sea itself was not yet fully controlled. This began to change at the turn of the 16th century. Not from within the region, but from far beyond it. European powers, driven by a new kind of ambition, were searching for direct access to the wealth of Asia. Spices, silk, precious goods that had long reached Europe through complex land and sea routes. Routes that passed through intermediaries, empires, merchants. Networks that could not be easily bypassed. Portugal sought to change this. By sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, Portuguese expeditions opened a new maritime path into the Indian Ocean, and with it came a different logic. Not participation in existing systems, but control over them. The objective was clear: to dominate the key maritime chokepoints that connected regions of trade. In this emerging network, the entrance to the Persian Gulf became strategically significant. The Strait of Hormuz. At the beginning of the 16th century, Portuguese forces established a presence in the region. They captured the island of Hormuz, located near the entrance of the strait, and there they built a fortress, not large by later standards, but decisive in its position. From this point, They could monitor and influence maritime traffic entering and leaving the Gulf. This marked a transformation. For the first time, the passage was not only a geographic constraint, but a controlled gateway. The Portuguese did not dominate the region entirely. Their power was limited, dependent on supply lines, exposed to local resistance, stretched across vast distances. And yet, their presence introduced a new principle, that control over narrow maritime passages could extend influence far beyond their immediate surroundings. It was an early form of global strategy, a recognition that power did not always require territorial expansion, but could be exercised through selective control. Over time, Portuguese dominance weakened. Local powers reasserted themselves, and new forces entered the region, among them the British Empire. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain had become the dominant naval power in the world. Its interests in the Persian Gulf were not incidental. They were part of a larger system. India, the most valuable part of the British Empire, lay to the east, and the sea routes connecting Britain to India were vital. Security of passage became a priority, not only across the open ocean, but within key transitional zones. The Persian Gulf, and with it the Strait of Hormuz, formed one of these zones. British strategy differed from that of the Portuguese. Rather than establishing isolated fortresses, Britain developed a network of influence, treaties with local rulers, naval patrols, political agreements that ensured stability, on terms favorable to British interests. The goal was not always direct control, but reliable access, predictability, the reduction of uncertainty. This approach proved effective. Over time, the Gulf became integrated into the broader framework of British imperial security. Maritime routes were monitored, potential disruptions contained, and the Strait of Hormuz remained open, not by chance, but through sustained presence. What had once been a passage shaped primarily by geography was now embedded within systems of power. The transformation was gradual, but profound, because it introduced a pattern that would persist. External powers projecting influence into the region, not necessarily to occupy it, but to ensure that what passed through it continued to flow, uninterrupted. By the end of the 19th century, the logic of control over strategic waterways had become an established principle of global politics, and the Strait of Hormuz was no longer just a regional feature. It had become part of a larger map, a map defined not only by land, but by movement, and by the growing realization that in a connected world, the narrowest passages often carry the greatest weight. Chapter 4. The Age of Oil. For centuries, the Strait of Hormuz had been a passage of trade. Goods moved through it. Empires observed it. Navies learned to respect its position. But its true significance, the scale that would define it in the modern world, had not yet emerged. That change began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not with ships, but with discovery. Beneath the deserts and coastlines of the Persian Gulf lay vast reserves of oil. At first, their importance was not fully understood. Oil had uses, industrial, mechanical, but it had not yet become essential. That transformation came gradually, and then, all at once. With the rise of industrial economies, energy demand expanded beyond traditional sources. Coal, once dominant, began to share its role. Oil offered something different. It was more efficient, more flexible, easier to transport, and, crucially, it could power engines, ships, vehicles, machines of war. In the early 20th century, naval powers began to recognize this shift. The British Royal Navy, once fueled by coal, transitioned to oil. a decision that carried strategic consequences. Because oil was not evenly distributed, it was concentrated, and much of it lay beneath the land surrounding the Persian Gulf. This changed everything. The region was no longer only a space of transit. It became a source. And the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which these resources had to travel, gained a new level of importance. Not regional. Global. Tankers replaced traditional cargo vessels. Their scale increased, their cargo more valuable, and their routes became predictable. From the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and later the United Arab Emirates, energy flowed outward, through pipelines to coastal terminals, onto ships, and from there through the Strait of Hormuz, toward Europe, toward Asia, toward the industrial centers of the world. This created a system of dependency unlike anything before. Entire economies, factories, transportation networks, military infrastructures, became linked to a continuous supply of oil, and a significant portion of that supply passed through a single geographic point, the Strait of Hormuz. By the mid-20th century, its role was no longer theoretical, it was measurable. A substantial share of the world's oil exports moved through this corridor, day after day, year after year. The flow became constant, and with constancy came vulnerability, because a system built on continuous movement cannot easily tolerate interruption. Any disruption, whether caused by conflict, accident, or political decision, would not remain contained. It would propagate through markets, through industries, through nations. Prices would rise. Supply chains would strain. Decisions made far from the region would be shaped by events within it. This is the moment when the Strait of Hormuz ceases to be merely strategic and becomes systemic. It is no longer just important because of its position. It is important because of what depends on it. The difference is subtle, but fundamental. A strategic location can be bypassed over time. A systemic dependency cannot. By the second half of the 20th century, this reality had become clear. Global powers understood that the uninterrupted flow of oil was not optional. It was essential. And the Strait of Hormuz stood at the center of that reality. A narrow passage, unchanged in its physical form, but now carrying a weight that extended far beyond its waters. The ships that moved through it were no longer simply part of trade. They were part of a system that sustained modern civilization. And from this point forward, any threat to that system would be understood not as a regional issue, but as a global concern. Chapter 5. Conflict, Crisis, and Control. By the second half of the 20th century, the Strait of Hormuz had become an essential artery of the global economy. Oil moved through it continuously. Markets depended on it silently. Nations adjusted their policies around its stability. For a time, this system appeared resilient. Tensions existed, but the flow continued. Then, in 1980, war reached the waters of the Persian Gulf. The conflict between Iran and Iraq began as a territorial and political struggle, but it did not remain confined to land. As the war progressed, both sides turned toward the infrastructure that sustained their opponent: oil, exports, shipping, economic lifelines. What followed became known as the Tanker War. Commercial vessels, many of them neutral, were targeted in an effort to disrupt the flow of energy. Missiles struck ships. Mines were deployed in shipping lanes. Insurance costs surged. The Persian Gulf, once a corridor of trade, became a zone of uncertainty. and at its narrow exit, the Strait of Hormuz stood exposed. The logic behind these attacks was not random. It was strategic. If one side could not fully control the flow of oil, it could attempt to deny it to the other, to raise the cost, to introduce instability, to force external powers to react. Because by this time, the flow of oil through the strait was no longer a regional concern. It was global. Disruptions, even limited ones, reverberated outward. Energy prices fluctuated. Supply concerns emerged. Political pressure increased. External actors began to take a more direct role. Naval forces, particularly from the United States, entered the region with a defined objective: to ensure the security of maritime passage. Convoys were established. Warships accompanied commercial tankers. Surveillance intensified. The presence was not symbolic. It was functional, a response to a system under strain. And yet, even with this increased military presence, the underlying tension remained unresolved, because the Strait of Hormuz presented a unique dilemma. It was too important to be ignored, too narrow to be easily secured, and too central to global systems to be allowed to fail. This created a condition of constant balance, not peace, but managed instability. Periods of relative calm were interrupted by moments of escalation, incidents at sea, seizures of vessels, confrontations that stopped short of open conflict. Each event carried a similar structure: a signal, a response, a recalibration. Over time, a pattern emerged. The strait was not closed. The flow was not fully interrupted. But the possibility of disruption remained ever present. And this possibility itself became a form of influence. Because in a system built on continuous movement, the threat of interruption can be as powerful as interruption itself. This is the nature of strategic chokepoints. Their power lies not only in what happens, but in what could happen. And in the Strait of Hormuz, this potential has never fully disappeared. Even in periods of relative stability, naval forces remain nearby, monitoring, deterring, preparing, not for a constant conflict, but for the possibility of one. Because the system that depends on this narrow passage has no simple alternative. And where there is no alternative, uncertainty becomes a constant companion. The strait endures. The ships continue to pass. But beneath the surface of routine movement, a quiet tension persists, a recognition shared by all who depend on it. That stability here is not guaranteed. It is maintained. Chapter 6. The present as continuation. The Strait of Hormuz today is often described in terms of tension. Headlines speak of threats, of confrontations, of the possibility of disruption. But to understand its present, it is necessary to look beyond the immediacy of events. Because what appears as instability is, in many ways, the continuation of a long-established pattern. The geography has not changed. The narrowness of the passage remains. The lack of alternatives persists. And the global system built around it continues to depend on uninterrupted flow. What has changed is the scale of interdependence. In earlier periods, disruption affected regions. Today, it affects systems. Energy markets respond within hours. Supply chains adjust across continents. Political decisions are shaped by expectations of stability or the lack of it. The Strait of Hormuz has become embedded in the structure of the modern world, not as an isolated point of interest, but as a functional element within a larger network. This network is complex. It includes producing states, whose economies rely on export, consuming nations whose industries depend on import, and external powers whose strategic presence reflects a commitment to maintaining access. Each of these actors interacts with the strait in a different way, but all are connected by the same underlying condition: dependence on continuity. This creates a paradox. The strait is too important to be closed, and yet its importance makes it a constant point of pressure. Actions taken within or around it are rarely isolated. They are signals, messages directed not only at immediate opponents, but at a wider audience: deterrence, positioning, influence. In this sense, the strait functions not only as a physical passage, but as a space of communication, where presence itself becomes meaningful. Naval forces operate in proximity, not always to engage, but to be seen, to signal capability, to establish boundaries without necessarily crossing them. This is not a static situation. It shifts, gradually, sometimes abruptly, but always within limits. Because all actors involved understand the same constraint, a full disruption of the strait would carry consequences that extend far beyond the region. And so a balance is maintained, not through stability in the traditional sense, but through restraint, calculated actions, measured responses, an ongoing effort to avoid crossing a threshold that would be difficult to reverse. This condition can appear fragile, and in many ways it is, but it is also durable, because it is reinforced not only by intention, but by necessity. The Strait of Hormuz remains open. Ships continue to pass. Energy continues to flow. And the system, despite its tensions, endures. Not because conflict is absent, but because its consequences are understood. Chapter 7. The Narrow Passage. The Strait of Hormuz has not changed. Its waters remain as they have always been: a narrow passage between two landmasses, a geographical certainty. And yet, across centuries, its meaning has transformed. What began as a route of early exchange became a corridor of empires. What served as a connection between regions became a point of control, and in time, a foundation of the modern world. Today, ships continue to pass through this narrow stretch of water, slowly, deliberately, carrying with them the energy that sustains distant cities, industries, and entire societies. Most of those who depend on this flow will never see this place. They will not stand on its shores. They will not witness the movement of vessels across its surface. And yet, their lives remain connected to it, not directly, but fundamentally, because the systems that define the modern world are often built upon places that remain unseen: narrow passages, invisible structures, quiet dependencies. The Strait of Hormuz is one of these places. Its importance does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply exists at the intersection of geography and necessity. And in that intersection, it continues to shape the world, not through constant upheaval, but through continuity, through the steady, uninterrupted movement of what must pass. And perhaps this is its most defining characteristic, that despite tension, despite conflict, despite the weight placed upon it, it remains open, a passage, as it has always been. And as long as the systems that depend on it endure, it will remain more than a place on a map. It will remain a narrow passage through which the balance of the modern world quietly flows.